Put that down right now.
Right now.
You think you can just walk into my school and touch things that don't belong to you? You people never learn. 300 students freeze. 150 parents stop breathing. An 11-year-old boy in a faded button-up shirt slowly lowers the violin bow he had barely touched. His name is Caleb Monroe. His shoes have a crack along the left sole. His shirt is ironed. His mother does that every morning before her 5 a.m. shift. He has never stolen anything in his life. Since you love that violin so much, Vice Principal Darren Voss says, his voice dripping with theater, why don't you play it? Right here, right now, in front of everyone. He smiles the way men smile when they already know the ending. The auditorium at Crestwood Elementary goes completely silent. Somewhere in the back row, a woman in a red work uniform grips the armrest so hard her knuckles go pale. Nobody in that room knows what's about to happen. Nobody except Caleb. Before we go any further, we want to hear from you.
Right now.
Drop a comment below and let us know where in the world you are watching from. We would love to hear from every single one of you. And if stories like this one move you, hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now let us go back to the beginning. Because to understand what happened inside that auditorium, you have to understand where Caleb Monroe came from. You have to understand what it costs a child to stand in a room full of people who have already decided he is nothing and choose to play anyway. The neighborhood is called Thomasville Heights, and it sits on the southeast side of Atlanta, Georgia, tucked between Flat Shoals Road and a set of railroad tracks that have been rusting since before most of the residents were born. It is the kind of place that does not appear on the tourist maps of the city. It does not appear in the glossy brochures that Atlanta hands out at conventions when it wants to show the world its gleaming skyline and its belt-lined walking trails and its carefully polished reputation as a city too busy to hate. Thomasville Heights is the Atlanta that the brochures forget. Chain-link fences running the borders of yards that have given up trying to grow grass. Corner stores with hand-painted signs and metal bars over the windows, installed so long ago that nobody can remember the year it happened. Churches on almost every other block, because when the government stops showing up, the church is what remains. A Georgia Budget and Policy Institute report found that income inequality in Atlanta is more severe than in almost any other major American city. And the consequences of that inequality land hardest on the children, on the schools, on the families who never asked to be a case study in a policy paper, but who wake up every single day living inside the data points that researchers write about from offices very far away. Thomasville Heights is one of those places. An apartment 4B, second floor, the one with the cracked window frame that lets in cold air every November, no matter how many towels Vanessa Monroe stuffs along the sill. That is where Caleb Monroe was born and where he has lived every single day of his 11 years on this earth. Vanessa Monroe was 33 years old, and she carried the kind of tired that sleep does not fix. It was the tired of a woman who had been doing the work of two people for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to carry only her own weight. She worked days as a home health aide, driving a 2009 Civic with a cracked windshield across the north side of Atlanta to sit with elderly patients who could not sit with themselves. She bathed them. She dressed them. She fed them. She reminded them of their medication and talked to them on the days when nobody else came, because loneliness is its own kind of illness, and Vanessa had enough heart to know that. She left her apartment before the sun came up, and often did not return until long after it had gone down. 3 nights a week, she worked a 4-hour shift at the gas station on Flat Shoals Road, standing behind a register that never quite closed right, taking money from strangers. Always smiling because smiling was part of the job, and the job paid, and the bills did not care how tired she was. She had been doing this since Caleb was 4 years old. Since the morning his father, Derek, packed 2 duffel bags and set them beside the front door and told Vanessa that he was not built for this kind of life. He did not elaborate on which part he meant. She never asked. He said he needed space. He said things were not working. He said she deserved better, which is the cruelest thing a man can say when he is the one doing the leaving. Vanessa did not cry until after he was gone. Then she cried for 3 days, and on the 4th morning she got up, ironed her uniform, dropped Caleb at her sister's apartment 6 blocks away, and went to work. She never missed a shift, not once, not in 7 years. Caleb understood his mother's exhaustion the way children understand things they were never directly taught. He could read it in the set of her shoulders when she walked through the door. He could read it in the way she sometimes stood at the kitchen counter and stared at nothing for a long moment before she remembered she was supposed to be making dinner. He could read it in the stack of envelopes on the kitchen table, each one sitting there like a small, patient threat. He was 7 years old the first time he noticed her pretending she had already eaten so there would be more food for him. He said nothing that night. He ate what she put in front of him, and he memorized the shape of her sacrifice, and he carried it with him the way a child carries something he has no box for. When that is the kind of thing that either hollows a child out or turns him into someone capable of enormous feeling. In Caleb's case, it did the second thing. It turned him into a boy who felt everything at full intensity, who walked through the world absorbing the weight of the people he loved, with no language yet for what lived inside him. Not until the violin found him. The violin arrived when Caleb was 6 years old. Vanessa had found it at a Goodwill on Moreland Avenue on a Saturday morning when she had 40 minutes between her last patient visit and the start of her evening shift. It was a half-size student instrument, scratched along the neck, missing its chin rest. With a horsehair bow that had lost more than half its hair, and a hard case that smelled of rosin and old wood, and something faintly sweet that Caleb would much later learn was the natural scent of aged maple. The price tag said $14. She bought it without a second thought. She rode the bus home with it on her lap, and when Caleb looked up from the cartoon he was watching and saw the case in her hands, something in his face shifted in a way she had never seen before. He did not ask what it was. He simply stared at it. She set it on the coffee table and opened the latches slowly, and the instrument lay there against faded blue velvet, like something that had been waiting a long time to be found. She had played violin herself for 2 years in middle school, whereas before the Atlanta school system cut the music program and sent the instruments back to a storage warehouse in Fulton County, where they presumably still sit. She remembered enough to show him the basics. She placed the instrument under his chin and adjusted his elbow and put the bow in his right hand and told him to draw it slowly across the D string. The sound that came out was scratchy and uneven, the way all first sounds are. But Caleb's eyes did not react the way most children's eyes react to their first bad note. He did not laugh. He did not wince. He tilted his head slightly like he was listening for something underneath the scratch. Something the instrument was trying to say through the awkwardness of a beginner's first attempt. He tried again, and on the fifth attempt, something in his posture changed. Vanessa saw it happen, and she could not have explained what she was seeing, but she felt it in her chest, like a frequency shifting, like a door opening in a room she did not know existed. Within 3 months, Caleb could play a clean scale in 2 octaves. Within 6 months, he was picking out melodies by ear after hearing them once on the radio. Vanessa would hum something in the kitchen, and by the time she walked back into the living room, Caleb would have it on the strings, not approximately precisely, with the phrasing intact. She borrowed books from the Atlanta Fulton Public Library. She found YouTube tutorials filmed in church basements, in college practice rooms and living rooms not unlike their own, and together they worked through them on the weekends, the boy and his mother, sitting on the floor of apartment 4B while the radiator clicked and the upstairs neighbors argued and the world outside moved at its regular pace, completely unaware of what was being built in that small room. By the time Caleb was 7, Vanessa knew what she had. She had seen enough in life to know the difference between a child who was good and a child who was chosen. Caleb was chosen. His ear was flawless. His memory was total. His feeling for the music was not something that could be taught because it was not something that had been taught. It was already inside him. The violin had not created it. The violin had simply given it a door. She tried to enroll him in the Fulton County Youth Strings program. The application was free. The instrument rental was not. The program fee for 1 semester was $380. She looked at her bank account. She looked at the fee. She looked at her bank account again. She put the application in the kitchen drawer and closed it, and she did not mention it to Caleb, and Caleb never asked. But she caught him one evening holding the program flyer she had left on the counter, reading it the way a child reads something he already knows he cannot have, quietly without complaint, putting it down with a face that revealed nothing. That face broke something in her. She went into the bathroom and ran the faucet so he would not hear her, and she stood there with her hand over her mouth for a long time. Then she dried her face, walked back into the kitchen, and started making dinner. She did not stop working to find another way. She never stopped. A Crestwood Elementary School sat 11 blocks from Thomasville Heights on a street that looked like it had been promising to repave itself for 15 years. The building was a wide, flat structure of brown brick, built in the 1970s, with casement windows that fogged up in winter and a gymnasium that doubled as a cafeteria, an assembly hall, and a voting location every November. The school served approximately 420 students. The majority qualified for free or reduced lunch. The music program had been cut twice in the past decade and partially restored once found through a small grant from a private foundation that ran out after 2 years. What remained was a single music class held twice a week in a converted storage room on the second floor, taught by a woman named Mrs. Patricia Okafor, who had been teaching music in Atlanta public schools for 29 years, and who kept teaching not because the system made it easy, but because she had seen enough to know that for some children, the music room was the only safe room in the building. Mrs. Okafor had noticed Caleb Monroe on the first day of second grade. She had been walking past the gymnasium during lunch when she heard a sound she was not expecting. A child was sitting alone at the edge of the lunch tables, humming something. Not a pop song, not a commercial jingle. He was humming Bach, specifically the opening of the air on the G string, with perfect pitch, with the phrasing shaped correctly, as though he had played it rather than merely heard it somewhere. She stopped walking. She stood in the doorway of the gymnasium for a full minute and listened. And then she walked over to his table and sat across from him. He looked up at her. "Where did you learn that?" she asked. "My mom has a video," he said. "She plays it sometimes when she folds laundry." Mrs. Okafor looked at this child for a long moment. "What else do you know?" she asked. He thought about it. Then he hummed 4 more things in succession. She recognized all of them. She went back to her classroom that afternoon and sat at her desk and thought for a very long time. From that day forward, Mrs. Okafor gave Caleb every minute she could spare. Before school on Tuesdays and Thursdays. During her prep period on Wednesdays. She had a school-owned violin, a full-size instrument too large for him, but which he adapted to with an ease that she had never seen in 29 years of teaching. She gave him proper technique. She gave him sheet music. She gave him recordings by Itzhak Perlman and Hilary Hahn and Ray Chen, and she watched his face as he listened, watched him absorb it the way a dry field absorbs rain, completely and immediately, as if the music had always been inside him, and the recordings were simply reminding him of what he already knew. By the end of second grade, he was playing at a 5th grade level. By the middle of 3rd grade, she stopped having a reference point for what level he was playing at. She wrote a formal recommendation to the school district's gifted arts program. She filled out every form. She wrote 4 pages about what she had witnessed. She submitted it through the official channel and waited. She received a form letter 6 weeks later explaining that the gifted program enrollment for that academic year had already closed. She submitted again the following year. The letter she received that time explained that the program was operating at capacity. She submitted a 3rd time. She never received a response. The man who ran Crestwood Elementary was Vice Principal Darren Voss. The principal, Dr. Angela Moore, had been on medical leave since October, and in her absence, Voss had assumed full operational control of the school with the enthusiasm of a man who had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. He was 47 years old, broad across the shoulders with close-cropped hair going silver at the temples and eyes that were pale and quick and constantly scanning. The way the eyes of someone who expects to catch people doing something wrong are always scanning. He had worked in Atlanta public schools for 19 years. And in that time, he had developed a philosophy about the children in his care that he never stated directly, but that shaped every decision he made. He believed in the place where his gut lived, that outcomes were determined early, that the data did not lie, that certain children arrived at his school already pointed toward failure by forces larger than he was, and that the most honest and therefore most humane thing he could do was to prepare them for the reality of that trajectory rather than encourage them with illusions they would never achieve. He called this realism. He called it doing them a favor. He never considered the possibility that the realism he was practicing was the thing creating the outcome he claimed only to be predicting. He had a particular sensitivity to what he called attitude. And Caleb Monroe, in his assessment, Hush had attitude, not the kind that showed up as defiance or aggression, the kind that was quieter and therefore more galling to a man like Voss. Caleb had the attitude of a child who had not yet accepted the verdict, who still walked into school every morning like he was walking towards something rather than away from it, who sat in the music room with Mrs. Okafor like the room was his birthright, who did not look at Darren Voss the way Voss expected to be looked at, which was with deference or fear or the lowered eyes of a child who understood his place. Caleb looked at him straight and level, not with disrespect, but with the quiet, unnerving steadiness of a child who simply had somewhere else to be in his mind and did not feel the need to pretend otherwise. Voss had called him to his office 3 times in 4 months, once for humming in class, once for what a teacher described as being unresponsive when she called his name, which meant he had been so deep inside a musical phrase he was working through in his head that it took him a moment to surface, and once for what Voss himself described as a failure to display appropriate respect, which meant Caleb had not looked at the floor when Voss was speaking to him. Each time Voss delivered the same sermon in different clothing, about the neighborhood Caleb came from, about the statistics that describe children from that neighborhood, about the gap between what a child imagined for himself and what the world was actually prepared to offer. He said all of this with a measured, almost gentle voice, the voice of a man who had convinced himself he was delivering medicine rather than poison. As Caleb sat in the plastic chair across from the desk each time and looked at the wall above Voss's shoulder and said nothing. Not because he had nothing to say, because his mother had told him years ago to save his voice for the violin. The people who matter, she told him, will hear you there. The spring assembly was the largest event on the Crestwood Elementary calendar. It was held in the school's auditorium, the one room in the building that had actual cushioned seats and curtains that ran on a track and stage lighting that worked on most of the switches. Parents arrived from across the neighborhood. Grandparents came on buses. A district coordinator named Richard Lawson attended every year to observe and report back to the superintendent's office. It was the one day that Crestwood Elementary was allowed to believe it could look like the schools on the other side of the city. Vanessa Monroe had requested the morning off from her home health agency. They had granted it without much grace, docking her pay for the hours. But she had come anyway, in the only professional clothes she still owned, a red blazer and dark slacks, clothes she had bought before Derek left, and that she only took out for things that mattered. She had ironed Caleb's shirt the night before. She had shined his shoes with a cloth and then looked at the crack along the left sole and felt the familiar mixture of sorrow and fury and love that had no name, and simply tightened the lace a little firmer. She sat in the back row of the auditorium because she had arrived from a morning patient visit and the front rows were already full, and from the back row she could see everything. The assembly opened with remarks from Darren Voss, who stood at the podium in a suit that fit him well and spoke about excellence and standards and the bright futures awaiting students who applied themselves. The kind of speech that sounds like inspiration but functions as a warning. The performances began. A 4th grade class sang a song they had been rehearsing since February. A 3rd grade science group presented a poster project. The school choir performed 2 numbers. Then came the moment that Voss had carefully arranged, the moment that was not listed in the printed program. A school-owned violin had been placed on a stand near the side of the stage, or left there by Mrs. Okafor, who used it for demonstrations when she brought her students up to perform. Before the next scheduled act, Voss walked to the side of the stage and lifted the instrument. He held it up, and then, with every parent and child in that auditorium watching, he walked to the edge of the stage and pointed into the audience. "Caleb Monroe," he said into the microphone, "would you come up here, please?" Caleb had been sitting in the 4th row with his class. He felt the air in the room change. He felt every head in his row turn toward him. He stood because there was no version of this moment in which he could remain seated without making it worse. He walked to the stage with his eyes forward and climbed the 3 steps and stood in the lights. Voss handed him the violin. Caleb took it. Oh, he looked at it for exactly 1 second. Then Voss leaned toward the microphone and said what he said. about touching things that did not belong, about some people never learning, and the auditorium, which had been the warmest room in the building, became the coldest. Caleb did not flinch. He did not look at his shoes. He looked at Darren Voss with those level, unblinking eyes, and he held the violin loosely in his left hand. The bow was in the stand beside where the instrument had sat. He had picked it up when he picked up the violin, almost without thinking, because his hand knew what to do near a bow, the way a bird knows what to do near wind. Voss said what he said about playing, about right here and right now and in front of everyone. The auditorium was so quiet that the ventilation system could be heard above them. Somewhere in the back row, a woman in a red blazer felt every muscle in her body go rigid. Mrs. Okafor, sitting in the front row reserved for teachers, gripped the edge of her seat. District Coordinator Richard Lawson set down his pen. 300 children stared at one boy standing alone in the lights, and Caleb Monroe looked out at all of them for a long moment, at this room full of people who had been gathered to watch him fail. And then he looked down at the instrument in his hand, and he thought about his mother on the bus, holding a $14 violin on her lap. He thought about Tuesday mornings before school and Wednesday prep periods, and the way Mrs. Okafor looked at him when he played something new for the first time, the way her whole face changed, the way she would go quiet and then say almost to herself, "Yes, okay, there it is. There it is." He thought about the kitchen drawer with the application in it. He thought about every office visit, every sermon, every prediction delivered in the calm voice of a man who had confused cruelty for clarity. He raised the violin to his chin. He positioned the bow. He closed his eyes, and then he began to play. What came out of that instrument in the next 4 minutes was not what anyone in that auditorium had prepared themselves to receive. Caleb played the first movement of Vivaldi's Four Seasons, Summer, the third movement, the Presto, one of the most demanding pieces in the standard violin repertoire. A work that professional musicians spend years mastering, a composition of extraordinary technical complexity and raw emotional force that Vivaldi wrote to describe the violence of a summer storm. So the kind of storm that does not ask permission and does not apologize for the damage it leaves behind. Caleb had been practicing it for 8 months. He had learned it from a recording Mrs. Okafor gave him on a USB drive, and from a borrowed score he had copied by hand into a notebook because he could not afford to print it. He had practiced it at home on the half-size Goodwill violin in apartment 4B with the door closed so as not to wake his mother before her 5 a.m. alarm, playing softly in the dark, playing the same passages over and over until his fingers could find every note without his mind having to direct them, until the music lived in his hands the way breathing lives in the lungs. Present and effortless and entirely his. The opening notes were soft, controlled. The bow moved across the strings with a lightness that seemed impossible for a child, drawing sound out of the instrument rather than pressing it out, the way a great player draws sound rather than forces it. The first few measures were almost gentle, and the auditorium exhaled, not in relief but in surprise, because this was not fumbling. This was not the halting, graceless sound of a child unprepared. This was something else entirely, and before the first phrase had ended, every person in that room felt it. The piece builds. That is the nature of the Vivaldi Summer Presto. It builds the way a storm builds, slowly at first, the pressure gathering at the edges of the sky, and then faster, and then all at once, with a force that no one who has not experienced it can fully anticipate. Caleb's bow began to move faster. His left hand shifted up the neck of the instrument with a precision that made Mrs. Okafor stop gripping her seat and simply stare, with her mouth slightly open. The notes cascaded. They rolled over one another and separated and rejoined the way water moves, with purpose and without hesitation. Children in the auditorium who had been nudging each other and passing notes and doing what children do when they are bored at school, assemblies went completely still. Parents who had been scrolling their phones looked up. Coaches and teachers who had spent years looking through Caleb Monroe looked at him now with expressions they had no time to hide. Expressions of shock, of recognition, of something approaching shame. Darren Voss stood at the side of the stage exactly where he had been standing when the music began. His arms were still crossed. His face was still composed, but something had gone wrong with his eyes. They had widened slightly and then been forced back to neutral, and the effort of that forcing was visible to anyone who looked closely enough. He had expected tears. He had expected failure. He had expected a child to break under the weight of public humiliation and give him the moment he was looking for, the confirmation of everything he had already decided. He had not expected this. He had not expected this at all. The music swelled into its central passage. Caleb's whole body was moving with it now, not performing, not showing off, because there was no performance in what he was doing. And there was only the music and the boy and the 4 years of early mornings and borrowed scores and a mother who bought a $14 violin and carried it home on a bus because she believed that some things do not look like what they are worth. The bow was a blur, the notes were flying, and then, without warning, they were not flying anymore. They were landing, one by one, heavy and precise, like a hand placed on a shoulder. The music shifted from storm to something sadder and more true, and in that shift, several things happened simultaneously in the auditorium at Crestwood Elementary School on that April morning. A woman in a red blazer in the back row began to cry without making a sound. Mrs. Patricia Okafor pressed both hands over her mouth, and the tears ran down over her fingers, and she did not try to stop them. Richard Lawson, the district coordinator who had attended this assembly for 6 consecutive years and had never once written anything in his notepad except logistical observations, began writing furiously. And in the 4th row, a girl named Destiny, who had been one of the children who laughed when Voss first called Caleb's name, sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes very wide, and something working in her face that was trying to be something she did not yet have a word for. Caleb played the final measures. The storm passed. The last note sustained in the air of the auditorium, long and clear and aching, and then his bow lifted from the strings and the sound ended, and the silence that followed was the kind of silence that only exists on the other side of something enormous. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3, 4. The silence stretched until it almost became unbearable, and then Vanessa Monroe stood up from her seat in the back row. She did not clap. She stood with her hands pressed to her chest and her eyes on her son, and the tears on her face catching the light from the stage. And then someone clapped, and then someone else. And then the auditorium opened up from the inside out. Every parent on their feet, every child scrambling up from their chairs, the room erupting in a wave of sound that was not just applause, it was release, it was recognition. It was 400 people acknowledging simultaneously that they had been in the presence of something they would not forget. Teachers who had never spoken a kind word to Caleb Monroe were standing with their hands over their hearts. The choir director was sobbing. Parents in the middle rows were clapping over their heads. Children were calling his name. Caleb, Caleb, Caleb. The name moved through the room like a current. Caleb stood on the stage with the bow at his side, and his eyes open and the sound washing over him. He was not smiling yet. He was doing something more private than smiling. He was simply receiving it. The way a person who has been cold for a very long time receives warmth, carefully at first, not quite believing it, letting it reach them slowly, making sure it is real. Then he looked across the stage at Darren Voss. Voss had not moved. His arms were still at his sides. His face was the face of a man watching something he cannot categorize, cannot file, cannot explain away. The satisfaction was gone. Whatever he had planned for this morning, whatever lesson he had arranged, the lesson had been given, just not the one he intended. Caleb looked at him for a long moment, not with anger, not with triumph, with something quieter and more final than either of those things. And then he turned away, because there was nothing left to say to a man who had already lost the argument. Richard Lawson did not write an observation report that week. He made a phone call. Then he made 3 more. The following Monday, he appeared at Crestwood Elementary with 2 colleagues from the district's arts education office and asked to meet with the school's administration. The meeting lasted 45 minutes. Darren Voss sat at the head of the conference table with the posture of a man who knows the room has turned. Lawson set a recording on the table. A parent had filmed the performance on a cell phone. One in the preceding 72 hours, that video had been shared across Facebook and then picked up by a local news station and then shared again, and the comment section had expanded into the thousands. People from Atlanta, and then from Georgia, and then from places further away, were watching an 11-year-old boy from Thomasville Heights play Vivaldi in a school auditorium while a vice principal stood at the edge of the stage, looking like a man being introduced to his own conscience. Lawson pressed play. He let it run to the end. The room was silent. Then he turned to Voss and asked him to explain the context in which the performance had come about. Voss began to explain. Lawson wrote things down. His colleagues wrote things down. The meeting ended without resolution, but with the understanding, delivered quietly and without drama, that certain processes were now underway. Within 2 weeks, a formal review of Voss's disciplinary conduct had been opened by the district. Teachers were interviewed. Records were reviewed. A pattern emerged in the data that the data had been quietly describing for years if anyone had chosen to read it. Students from Thomasville Heights referred to Voss's office at a rate significantly higher than students from the school's other attendance zones. A disproportionate number of those students shared Caleb's demographic. Complaints filed by Mrs. Okafor over the preceding 3 years regarding interference with the music program had been logged and then set aside without response. The review took 6 weeks. At the end of it, Darren Voss was placed on administrative leave pending further evaluation. He did not return to Crestwood Elementary. The last anyone heard, he had moved out of the district entirely. His name became a training example in a professional development seminar on implicit bias that the district rolled out the following school year. He is not remembered at Crestwood. The teachers do not bring up his name. The children who were there that day remember the morning differently. They remember the violin. The video reached 1 million views on the 9th day. It reached 2 million on the 12th. A journalist from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution wrote a piece that was picked up by 3 national publications. The headline in one of them read, "An 11-year-old was called a thief and given a violin." What he did next left an auditorium in tears. Mrs. Patricia Okafor was quoted extensively. She said, among other things, that she had been trying to get this child seen by the right people for 3 years, and that sometimes it takes the wrong person doing the wrong thing to finally make the right people pay attention. She said she was grateful it happened when it did, and angry it took that long. She said both things in the same sentence without contradiction, because they were both equally true. Vanessa Monroe gave one interview. She agreed to it because the journalist was a woman who had grown up in Thomasville Heights and who understood, without being told, what it meant to have your child's worth proven to people who should have seen it without proof. Vanessa sat at the kitchen table in apartment 4B and spoke for 40 minutes. She talked about the Goodwill violin and the bus ride home. She talked about Tuesday mornings before school. She talked about the kitchen drawer and the application she put inside it and could not afford to take out. She talked about ironing his shirt every morning because she could not control what happened to him outside the apartment, but she could send him out into it looking like he was worth something, because he always had been, and she needed the world to at least have to work harder to pretend otherwise. She cried once, at the end, and then stopped and looked at the journalist across the table and said, "I am not raising him to need the world's applause, but I would be lying if I told you this did not feel like justice." 3 weeks after the assembly, an envelope arrived at apartment 4B addressed to Caleb Monroe. The return address was the Atlanta Music Project. Vanessa handed it to him without a word and stood in the kitchen doorway with her arms folded across her chest. He opened it at the kitchen table. He read it once. Then he looked up at her. The Atlanta Music Project was offering him a full scholarship to their Youth Strings Academy, a program that provided intensive instruction, instrument access, mentorship from professional musicians, and a pathway to audition preparation for the region's most competitive music conservatories. The scholarship covered all fees. It covered instrument rental for a full-size violin, the right size for him now, and a new bow. It covered transportation from Thomasville Heights. It covered everything. Caleb set the letter on the table. He looked at his mother. Vanessa Monroe unfolded her arms. As she walked to the table and she sat down across from him and she put her hands flat on the surface and she looked at her son for a long time without saying anything. Then she said very quietly, "We are going to need to press your shirt tonight." He started the following Monday. He was nervous. The building was on the north side of the city. The hallways were wider than Crestwood Elementary, and the practice rooms smelled of fresh wood and rosin, and the particular concentration of people who are trying very hard at something they love. The other students had cases that cost more than the monthly rent at apartment 4B. Some of them had been playing since they were 3 years old with private teachers, whose hourly rates Caleb could not have calculated. He walked in with his eyes forward and his shoulders steady, and his hands already knowing exactly what they were there to do. The director of the program was a man named James Whitfield, who had performed with the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra for 11 years and who had a way of watching students play that was so still and so total that it felt like being read. On Caleb's first day, Whitfield asked him to play something, anything, whatever felt natural. Caleb thought for a moment, then he played the Vivaldi. Whitfield listened with his hands folded in his lap and his eyes closed, and when it ended, he sat with the silence for a long time before he opened his eyes. Then he said very simply, "We have a lot of work to do." He paused. "You are going to be extraordinary." He said both things as though they were the same sentence, not because to him they were. The work and the extraordinary were not opposites. They were the same destination from different angles. Caleb nodded. He understood. Mrs. Patricia Okafor retired at the end of that school year. 29 years of fighting for children in rooms that were not built for them, of submitting applications that were not answered, of teaching in converted storage rooms with broken heating and borrowed instruments. She retired not because she was finished, but because she had done the specific things she was placed in that school to do, and she knew it, and she wanted to leave before the system's attrition could take anything else from her. She attended Caleb's first public recital at the Atlanta Music Project 6 months after the assembly. She sat in the second row and she did not cry until the last note, and then she cried the way someone cries when a thing they have believed in for a long time without evidence is finally proven true. After the performance, Caleb found her in the lobby. He walked straight to her, the way he always walked, forward and certain, and he said, "I want you to know that every note tonight was you too." She shook her head. He nodded. They both knew the truth was somewhere in between, in that quiet space between a teacher who sees and a child who is finally, truly seen. There are children in every city in this country who are sitting in classrooms right now with something enormous living inside them. Something that has not been named yet. Something that has not been given a stage or a teacher or a $14 instrument, carried home on a bus by someone who believed in it before it could prove itself. When there are Calebs in Atlanta and Detroit and Chicago and Baton Rouge and Fresno and everywhere else that the brochures do not photograph. And there are Vanessa Monroes waking up before the sun, ironing shirts, tightening laces over cracked soles, sending their children out into a world that will make them prove themselves over and over again before it will admit that they were always already worth it. This is not a story about an extraordinary exception. This is a story about what happens when someone is finally allowed to be what they already were. Caleb Monroe was not made extraordinary by a scholarship or a standing ovation or a video that reached 2 million views. He was extraordinary in apartment 4B at 6 in the morning with a $14 violin and no audience. He was extraordinary in Mrs. Okafor's storage room on Tuesday mornings. He was extraordinary in Darren Voss's office, sitting in the plastic chair, looking at the wall, saving his voice for where it mattered. The auditorium did not create what it witnessed. It only finally got out of the way, and the boy played. And the truth, as it always does, eventually found its voice, and nothing after that was ever quite the same.